Hello everybody, it's me, Fiona Timms, and welcome. I'm also known as White Zulu, by the way, and the author of 5 autobiographies. They are all now in video format and available on my playlists on YouTube. You just have to go to White Zulu, not the White Zulu, that's Johnny Clegg, just White Zulu, and you'll find me there and everything that I've put out. So, I want to welcome you to the final couple of chapters from an autobiography I wrote when I was working at the Centre for Rehabilitation of Wildlife, otherwise known as CROW, in Yellowwood Park near the Steenbank Reserve in Durban. I never got to finish this diary as I became too ill to continue writing, but I can give you the chapters I did complete. I'd also like to thank all you dedicated subscribers who post warm comments and give me such encouraging feedback. So sit back, relax, and enjoy another tale from the Bushveld. This one is called CROW 1991 to 1997, the week-old baby white rhino. I lived there on the premises of CROW in a little asbestos hut right at the bottom of the grounds, past all the old settling ponds. CROW had originally been a water purification plant, but long disused. All that remained of it was 6 settling ponds, 2 of which were still filled with clean but stagnant water, and into which we put rescued crocodiles and terrapins. The other 4 were dry pens with very sturdy walls and ideal for housing larger animals, like an adult porcupine and a fully grown bush pig, also larger antelope, which had been hit by cars, stunned but not seriously injured, so we could release them. On a small grassy hillside, we kept the weaned baby buck, which were too tame to be released into reserve, but could go onto a game farm. 2 of the pens were covered with a roof of corrugated iron and surrounded with chain link wire between the walls of the old pond and the tin roof, with an open chain link wire front. This housed the 50-odd vervet monkeys, most of which were fully grown, and to which we added the baby ones after they were weaned. This project was to form a viable troop to be released within the next year or so, once the numbers had reached 70. It's an extremely difficult task to find a game farm or a game reserve which will take vervet monkeys, as, like baboons, they are also declared vermin. Farmers didn't want them anywhere near their crops and were perfectly entitled to shoot them, and we had to find somewhere, possibly a newly formed game reserve or game farm, to take the entire troop. The entrance of the CROW gates was a row of specially built mammal cages with 3 brick walls and a front of strong wire mesh. They all faced the sun. Into these we put smaller birds and mammals like mongooses, genets, meerkats, lemurs, and small birds separately. These would all be released when the season was right and there was enough food in the wild. The grounds themselves covered about 8 acres and had no surrounding fence. It was heavily overgrown to 10 feet high, with massive weeds of all descriptions, all alien invaders, including some very tall gum trees. It was certainly not a secure place, apart from the electrically operated front gates next to the office and clinic. There was no fencing around the property at all. My father was so anxious about the lack of security there that he bought me a cell phone. Right at the very bottom end of the grounds was the manager's dwelling, a nice 3-bedroomed house specially built for him. Just beyond his house was a small asbestos tool shed, which had been converted into a 2-roomed cottage with a bathroom, and this was where I lived. In early 1991, after divorcing my second husband for his drinking and gambling habits, I was subsequently admitted to the Town Hill Psychiatric Hospital in Pietermaritzburg because I was so ill with the as yet undiagnosed ME. My parents, with whom I'd been living on the farm for some months, decided that they would put me into the loony bin to shock me out of this laziness, as they described it. I enjoyed every minute of my 3 weeks in the acute ward at Town Hill Hospital. After my 3-week course was finished, I left Town Hill with great reluctance because there I had received a lot of support in the way of pain relief, sleep medication, and, most valuable of all, counseling from both psychiatrists and psychologists, something that I hadn't received after my first husband died in such tragic circumstances in Scotland in 1973 when I was 23, leaving me with a 13-month-old baby. Those stories have already been told and are in the playlists on my YouTube site. Since my second husband had left me penniless and homeless and seriously ill with ME, my parents put me into a very dismal, cheap boarding house on the Berea in Durban. It was a depressing place, but I felt slightly better having had some respite and care from Town Hill Hospital. I began to volunteer at the Centre for Rehabilitation of Wildlife, otherwise known as CROW. So I would drive my clapped-out old Mazda 323 to volunteer at CROW in the mornings and, for a small salary, helped out the head ranger at the Steenbank Natal Parks Board Nature Reserve in the afternoons. He had been issued with a computer and had no clue as to how to use it, nor did he have the time. So he asked me to take over secretarial duties for him. A regulation Natal Parks Board uniform, badge and epaulettes, and I would spend the afternoons in the nice, cool, thatched office, loading all his data onto his new computer and writing letters for him. I created a spreadsheet for his stock in the little curio shop there. I made him a payroll for his staff and generally made things easier for him to manage if, with some luck, I went to CROW full time. I still have my badge and uniform, but I don't know what's happened to the Natal Parks Board, as things were starting to backslide even then, especially after 1994. Since I was on their payroll, I was appointed an honorary Natal Parks Board ranger way back in 1991. Manager at CROW was Chris Brown, and I had 3 colleagues who were young fellow clinic nurses there, all of them in their late teens. I was by far the oldest veterinary nurse as I was 45 years old and my sons had already gone to UCT. Chris, the manager, had a fight with the senior nurse, Michelle, and fired her, and I was a shoo-in as a replacement nurse there. I was offered the prefab asbestos hut as free accommodation on the condition that I took in all the after-hours patients. My salary was 900 Rand a month, along with medical aid. It was perfect. I moved in, slept on the floor on a double mattress, and I loved the work. Having grown up and spent my first 18 years living on the farm, I knew everything there was to know about raising orphaned lambs, calves, and other domestic animals like kittens and puppies. I've always had a lifelong fascination with wild birds. I had been the secretary for the Natal Midlands Bird Club for many years in the 1980s and know every single species to be found in southern Africa. So I knew exactly what to feed every baby bird when it was brought in, because I'd easily and instantly identify the species. Same with buck, mongooses, and even the reptiles. I had come across almost all of them in my formative years, and being a very curious child, had learnt everything there was to know about them from either watching them, looking after them, or reading up on them in encyclopedias. I had wanted to be a vet from a very young age, but Dad refused to let me go to Onderstepoort, the only veterinary college in South Africa. It was Afrikaans medium, and he couldn't stand boots, as he referred to them. All this preparation came in its own, and I have to admit I was very good at my job. I would come back to my cozy little hut after my long shifts, my old car laden with pet carriers containing baby animals like newborn monkeys, jennets, banded mongooses, a tree squirrel named Squiggles, a young meerkat confiscated by the Natal Parks Board as someone was keeping her as a pet, a couple of baby scrub hares, several baby buck, including bushbuck, blue duikers, a red duiker on one occasion, and even a little baby steenbok, which somebody had picked up and brought in from the Ladysmith area, and a baby porcupine. Of course, excuse me, there was the annual summer flood of baby vervet monkeys. Often I had up to 5 of them at a time, tucked into a shawl and tied around my waist. We nurses each worked 5 days on and 3 days off, and our shifts were either 7 a.m. till 3 p.m. or 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. I always chose the 9 to 5 shifts, as it gave me a chance to sleep a little longer. I hadn't breathed a word to anybody that I was suffering from ME and had very little stamina, pretty much as I'd done in the camps in the Delta in Botswana. However, I made sure I was able to get the maximum amount of rest at every opportunity, as I had to get up all night to feed babies and warm up their hot water bottles, as they were so used to being kept warm by their mothers through the night. After a very broken night's sleep, I would wake up the next morning and after a bowl of muesli for breakfast, tackle the next long, hot and arduous day on my feet in the clinic. At 5 p.m. I'd stagger into my hut, filthy, hot and exhausted after a long shift, sometimes even longer than usual, as somebody would drop in after hours with an injured animal or bird or even a snake, and I would have to see to it and leave it stitched up wounds dressed, fed and comfortable before leaving the clinic and only getting home at 7 p.m. I would run a bath for myself, after which I would have a bite to eat and then continue feeding and putting all my various little babies to bed. Then I would sit in front of the TV. While watching the programs, I had to carefully wash and iron my khaki uniforms. I only had 2 of them, and I'd carefully sew back on the buttons which my patients had bitten off, or painstakingly stitch up the inevitable rips and tears that they made with their sharp little beaks, teeth, and claws. Shortly after I took up my job at Crow, Chris Brown was offered a better, more enticing job in the Natal Parks Board, running a houseboat on Natal Dam, and he left. The committee was taking their time interviewing for a new Crow manager, and in the meantime, they installed the secretary at the time as temporary manager. She moved into the manager's house right at the furthest end of the bottom of the gardens, next to my hut, and took up the reins of the establishment with no qualifications or experience whatsoever. She was also very young, a single mother with 2 small children, and completely unsuited for the job. Chris had already started causing problems for me by boasting to the staff and the committee what a wonderful touch I had with animals, and that so far not one of them in my care had died, but been released back into the wild, healthy and fit. Since the wild animals got most of the press and attention from visitors on open day Sundays, this was not well received by my colleagues, and they started to gang up against me. The temporary manageress, who was only a few years older than they were, started going out clubbing together with them in the evenings, while I stayed in to look after all my charges and admit any after-hours patients. Naturally, while the 4 young women were partying, they formed a bond, leaving me an outcast in the workplace as well. I was there from 1991 to 1997, and the little white rhino who was handed to us as a week-old calf came to us in 1995. I had been at Crow for 6 years when a Natal Parks Board bucky arrived with the baby rhino. Accompanying him were 2 young game rangers and a Zulu game guard. I was almost his sole carer, as I lived on the premises permanently and was always there when the other 3 teenage nurses had gone off after their shifts at 3 o'clock. I did all the night feeds, 2 bottles every 2 hours round the clock, as well as a 10-hour shift in the clinic. I have never known to be that exhausted, even when I had my own 2 babies and fed them every 4 hours round the clock. I was in slight remission from my ME at the time, but far from being 100% well. We put him into the sunniest and best sheltered of the mammal cages and covered the bottom and sides with dry straw. The first thing we had to do was feed him, as he was ravenous. The Zulu game guard gave me 2 2-litre bottles of the formula. These were Coke bottles, plastic, which they had made up for him, and one of the 3 young nurses snatched them from me and was about to feed him when I suggested that she warm it up first. I had spent all my life on the farm hand-raising orphaned animals, so I knew what the procedure was. I asked the game guard in Zulu what the formula was, and he handed me a crumpled piece of paper with it written on there. I went up to the operating room in the clinic to examine the piece of paper and found to my astonishment that it contained just 2 ingredients: 3 parts glucose powder and 1 part Denkovit, which is a soy-based calf substitute. One I knew well, as I'd fed our own calves on this particular formula myself, but I'd never put any glucose in it. It seemed very strange to me how much glucose there was in this mixture, and queried it. But the guard just shrugged and said that the rangers told him to feed it with the mixture. I was determined to pursue this further, as I knew it was wrong. But on first sight, the little calf seemed healthy enough and had spent his first 2 days on it. He wasn't technically an orphaned animal, but had been rejected by his mother after she had been darted from the air by helicopter during the annual Umfolozi game capture unit and captured. Rangers had kept this mother and baby together for 2 days to see if she would allow him to suckle. But every time he went near her teats, she pushed him away with her nose or shoved him off with her back foot. After it became clear that she was not going to accept him, probably through the stress of having been sedated from the air with a powerful drug called M99, captured, boxed up, and trundled over the veldt to the bomas on the back of a lorry, and then released into the main auction boma, she had then given birth to him. Although she had been marked for capture, it had been overlooked that she was heavily pregnant. It was all too much for her, and after her constant rejection of the calf, the rangers decided to release her and hand-raise the calf themselves. He had to be fed every 2 hours, and this became an impossible task for the men, both white game rangers and Zulu game guards, who already had their hands full, making up the quota of animals like black and white rhinos, buffalo, giraffe, and several species of large antelope, which were to be auctioned off to various international zoos before it became too hot to continue the capture process. This took place in the cooler months of June and July, and the auction was to start at the beginning of September. So they asked us to look after the baby rhino, and we accepted with alacrity. The reason for game capture was that poaching had become so rife in Umfolozi particularly, and Hluhluwe game reserves, now amalgamated, particularly amongst the black and white rhinos, that the gene pool was becoming compromised, and something had to be done very quickly to get these very rare and endangered animals right away from South African reserves, where poaching went on everywhere, and into the European, Asian, and American zoos where they would be safe. It wasn't an ideal practice, but the only way they could think of to save the rhinos of both species becoming extinct. They are already on the red data list, meaning that they are on the brink of extinction. Ironically, even after the game capture went on year after year and the poaching continued, it was finally discovered where the animals were disappearing to. After a search of the Zulu Game Guard staff huts, the Natal Parks Board officials discovered parts of a rhino horn, a foot, and some rhino hide under one of the men's beds. It was the Zulu game guards who had been issued with rifles to protect both species of rhino, followed them around all day, and most importantly, knew exactly where they slept. Both black and white rhinos sleep in a group, all huddled together to keep their calves safe from the big carnivores like lions and even hyenas. So the guards knew exactly where to find them, shot them with the firearms they were issued with to protect them, and sold them on to a cartel of Chinese game traffickers who had a ship anchored conveniently offshore at Richards Bay for just a few hundreds of rands. A heartbreaking story for us all. That's all for now. I'll give you the next part next time. And thank you so much for listening. Goodbye. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to my videos and my stories of my life. And I want to thank John Moslane for being what I call the sound engineer, but I'm sure there's a more professional word for it. However, faithful, and for 4 years now, I think, he has been here for me every Wednesday. Well, I think it's Wednesdays, but once a week to record 2 chapters of whichever book it is I'm reading. And without him, this couldn't be done. So a big thank you to John. Also, Sean van Vuren, we send the videos to him. Sorry, I'm not reading this. I'm just doing it off the cuff. And my brain is a bit tumor. And Sean uploads them to the YouTube channel where you can find them all in playlists. He does it beautifully. And I want to thank them both for all the help that they give me. Well, it's not help. They do everything for me. And it's a great asset. So also, I have a website called whitezulubook.com, obviously www in front of it, but you'll find it there. Quite easy to find. Johnny Clegg's called The White Zulu. Mine's called White Zulu. And you will find on my website, you'll find all kinds of photographs going way back to when my ancestors settled in the Cape, 1652. Well, not photographs of them, but descriptions. This photograph of my grandmother's wedding, and lovely, lovely photos of the farm we still own. My sister sent me a photograph this morning of the farm in midsummer, and she says how beautiful it's looking. I've had a lot of rain. So, just want to thank my helpers, John and Sean, to thank you all for listening, and also please share this with everybody else. Hit the like button and enjoy. Goodbye.